Margaret Barker have developed, as well as several other scholars now, is that Elyon is an epithet of Yahweh, but it is a late characteristic put onto Yahweh. Originally, El and Yahweh were certainly separate, El being Yahweh's father. That has been changed through the transmission of time and the text. This happened basically with the post-Babylonian captivity Judaism. In the Judaism before then, El was understood to be the father, and they've brought forth many arguments discussing this. Much scholarly attention has been discussed on Yahweh and his Asherah, and of course he didn't have William G. Dever's book, Did God Have a Wife?, which he has demonstrated conclusively and powerful. He's outdated Jim Adams here. Jim Adams needs to do some updates. He's dead wrong in saying that Yahweh and his Asherah are not husband and wife. I'll go with Dever any day. He assumes a uniform theology throughout history in his argument. This is Adams' fundamental flaw. He assumes that what we have today is pretty much what Israel had back in the ancient times. This is absolutely fundamentally false. And I want to share a couple of sources that shows a couple of these answers to Jim Adams' arguments. Mark S. Smith, in his 2001 study, The Untold Stories, discussing the Bible and Ugaritic Studies in the 20th Century, Hendrickson Publisher, he notes on page 210 and 211 and 212, specifically, the Ugaritic texts reveal two basic notions that provided conceptual unity in both Ugaritic and Israelite polytheism, namely the divine council and the divine family. These two constructs of divinity also illuminate the development of Israelite monotheism in the 7th and 6th centuries. See, the monotheism is a late development in Israelite history. It was not had in the early parts of the Old Testament. Even though we have nothing of the polytheism, that's because it's been rewritten, and Mark Smith says that. He notes, still on page 210, while the language of counsel continues strongly in biblical texts after the exile, the metaphor of the divine family largely disappears. What generally remained is a system headed by the chief god, his consort, subordinate deities, some as members of his retinue, astral bodies, and servant messengers, all of which later Israelite tradition reduced further to a single god and various retainers. And this is the point that Jim Adams doesn't acknowledge. Furthermore, Margaret Barker, in her Great High Priest, let's see if I've got it here. Yes, here we go. Page 282. Margaret Barker, this is her book, The Great High Priest, a good read, a very good read. You must get Margaret Barker's writings. She writes so powerfully. The first temple had known El Elyon, God Most High and Father of the sons of God, whose firstborn had been Yahweh, the Lord, the great angel, the Holy One of Israel. The high priest king in Jerusalem had been Emmanuel, the presence of the great angel with his people. He had become divine at his anointing, and had been given the four names, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, names which in the Greek Septuagint simply became the Angel of Great Counsel. This is Isaiah 9:6. Then later on she shows this is on page 285. The old title for El Elyon was modified in the wake of the temple reform, as can be seen from its reuse by Deutero-Isaiah, who, as the prophet of monotheism, simply equated El and Yahweh, and made the one God male. The whole idea of divine sonship and apotheosis, that is, divinization, humans becoming divine, apotheosis, which had been central to the royal cult, was democratized so that everyone was a divine son. Deuteronomy 14:1. El Elyon, the ancient procreator, was identified as Yahweh, and the one God became the maker rather than the procreator. And then she mentions also wisdom, the goddess. This is on page 286, the female figure described in Proverbs 8:22, who was begotten as the first of the Creator's works. Now this reflects very powerfully Mark Smith's book, The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, Israel's polytheistic background in the Ugaritic texts. Now this text was available to Adams. This was published in 2001, but he didn't utilize it. And he discusses the 4 tiers of the divine council as head beings and the pantheon, and how these tiers of the pantheon, that is the council of the gods, with the head god as the father and his sons and the mothers and so on and so forth. In Israel, this had become truncated. It had become meshed together into a single deity. And he shows the changes, well, page 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51. He's discussing the divine council for dozens of pages. And he says the basis of the divine council was the paradigm of the divine family. And the divine household, of course, had fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, and this is what the council consisted of. Very reminiscent of Abraham chapter 3 in our Pearl of Great Price. He discusses the formation of monotheistic theologies in biblical literature and how monotheism in Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 was developed and how it was changed out of the earlier polytheism. Very powerful book discussing the archaeological information showing that there was not a uniformity of theology, that theology had been changed through the centuries. The LDS scholar and researcher Eugene Sach, in his Ancient Texts and Mormonism, this is self-published in 1995. This is the second edition. It's a magnificently huge tome. He says L's equivalent title, this is on page 182, L's equivalent title, Elohim, had its origin in pre-Mosaic times as a plural form which echoes the ancient polytheism. And he's quoting B.W. Anderson in the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible. There was an earlier polytheism. So when we read, "Let us make man in our image," Genesis 1:26, we are hearing in demythologized form the speech of the gods in the heavenly council discussing the begetting of man, which was always by the outpouring of semen, according to William F. Albright. Very remarkable there. This presupposes the existence of goddesses too, just like in the ancient Ugaritic pantheons. Well, none of this is in the Bible. No, of course not. Margaret Barker has demonstrated how this biblical material has been rewritten, changed. That's her whole thesis of the Great High Priest. Her book, The Older Testament, the survival of themes from the ancient royal cult in sectarian Judaism and early Christianity. She discusses how in the ancient world, in Isaiah's world, well, this is on page 137, for instance, Isaiah's world was one of angels. He saw the heavenly throne. He was commissioned in the heavenly council. He knew of the conflict with corrupted wisdom, of royal star figures climbing the holy mountain. He knew of heavenly armies and of the angel of Yahweh destroying an army before the walls of Jerusalem. He could assure Hezekiah that any king who came in pride against the Holy One would not succeed. The old mythology persisted as the immediate source of the Enochic works. And this underlies the thought forms and metaphors. This is what was changed. This is what was taken out. Adams doesn't discuss any of this. On his argument against Deuteronomy 32,